received the agenda. You have received the agenda and the bio of our speakers. So to save time, I will introduce them very shortly, one after the others. MyCERN is the Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network. We are, next slide, Christine, please. We are linking 17 child health organizations and 3 maternal health research organizations across the country. So we are not based in a particular place. The corporate office is in Vancouver, but most people working for MyCERN are all across the country. And this is why we are respectfully acknowledging the indigenous people of all the lands across Canada. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please take a short moment to reflect and recognize the lands you are logging in from today. Yeah, thank you, Christine. So we live a very exciting time. There are more and more advanced therapeutic products for rare disease for pediatric conditions coming from the pipeline, whether it's biological, gene therapy, somatic cell therapy. In the meantime, the regulations in the US and the EU require pediatric trials and data for any innovative medicine and trial. So we are in the situations where there are many drugs and new therapy to be tested, and there is maybe not enough patients that could benefit from those trials when trials are conducted following, the classic approach. So we thought that it would be the good time to have a workshop organized on the topics of platform trial. And to do so, we gather a list of outstanding speakers and panelists for this workshop. This slide will summarize the objective that we are hoping to address and to achieve. The first 3 will be the topics for the first half of this workshop, and the 2 last will be topics for the second part, where we are hoping to have conversations with the involvement of all the attendees. So we will start with the first presentations with Dr. Craig Campbell. Dr. Campbell is the interim chair and chief of the Department of Pediatrics at Western University. He is a specialist in neuromuscular disease and has conducted many trials, both academic sponsor and industry sponsor. He's going to introduce this workshop by providing a brief overview of what is the current business of AFER and why we need a new approach in terms of clinical trial design. Thank you, Craig. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Sari, for the introduction and really for the invitation to partner on this workshop. I think when you reached out and imagined something like this, I not only was I thrilled to be to be asked to be a part of it myself, but also to be able to bring neuromuscular and specifically Duchenne muscular dystrophy to the audience as as an example. It's obviously an area that I work in, day out, have journeyed with some amazing and exceptionally brave families who have not only are dealing with DMD, but have mustered the courage to be involved in clinical trials and to be advocates for the disease. And so, in many ways, I look forward to this workshop outcomes as a way to feed back new knowledge into our neuromuscular community. And I'm thrilled to be sharing the stage with so many speakers, but I do want to make just a special shout out, of course, to Craig McDonald, who is joining us from UC Davis, who really is a giant in our field, and will impart a lot of knowledge and experience to us today. So I'm going to start with just setting the tone and the context for the discussion for the rest of the day. As I mentioned, we did choose to sort of focus this discussion around platform trials on Duchenne muscular dystrophy as an example. So I'm going to start out with just an introduction to Duchenne for some of you who may not be as familiar with that muscular dystrophy and some of the approaches to treatment. Christine, if you could advance there. I do have a number of disclosures. I think this reflects having one of the more active clinical trial sites in North America, but probably more importantly, reflects some of the journey I've had through the hope and heartbreak that I'm going to describe a little bit more for you around clinical trials. Next. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk first just an introduction briefly to Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the novel therapeutics and actually not even just novel therapeutics. I'm going to just talk about the paradigm for management of DMD, and then finally finish with some of the upsides, downsides, and ugly sides or the good, bad, and the ugly of the clinical trial environment. And that's where I'll really pass over, I think, to Craig McDonald to go into that more forward thinking about trial design. Next slide, if you can. So many of you will know that DMD is an excellent condition. It affects about 1 in 5,000 live male births. And typically what we see as the main presentation for these boys is a delay in their motor milestones, and that can start quite early. And there's been some very good work showing that there's some differences even early on, often in motor development. But classically, what we see is boys coming to attention usually around 3, 4, 5 years of age as their motor skills really diverge from their peers. And what does that mean? Often frequent falls, poor ability to run and jump. The classic kind of Gowers maneuver, which I'm showing here in this diagram on the side, where the child sort of walks themselves up their own body as a way of using their hands as a way of standing up. So this is sort of one of those textbook things we hear about with Duchenne. And then high muscle enzyme elevation, so that we can measure an enzyme in the blood called the CK, which is typically extraordinarily elevated. And that usually comes to light, obviously, when we're concerned about the motor milestones, but sometimes in the workup for other illnesses, someone measures a CK and we become aware of this. And then increasingly too, in kids who have developmental differences, increasingly chromosome microarray testing is being done, which also is becoming a much higher proportion of the new referrals that are picked up, again through this genetic screening testing that's done in many developmental or neurology clinics. The condition often progresses through to a loss of ambulation by about 10 to somewhere between 10 and 16 years. And this is a life-limiting disease. And, now the median life expectancy might be somewhere in the range of 25, 26, 27 years old in developed countries where we have access to BiPAP and other supportive therapies. If you can go to the next slide. And here's just a little bit of a breakdown of the time frame of that, just another way of looking at this, the early onset motor manifestations progressing to loss of ambulation in that age range between 10 and 16. And then in that late non-ambulatory phase, things become more and more of a struggle with upper extremity use, and ultimately even breathing function and cardiac function become problematic because, of course, those are driven by muscle functions, and then this mean age of death somewhere typically in the mid 20s age range. Next slide, please. And DMD is primarily a muscle disease. Of course, you can imagine from what I've described here that there's significant comorbidity with DMD. One of the main things that not necessarily everyone understands is how much mental health and cognitive disability there is with DMD, and it's not all because of concerns around having a chronic disease and the impact of that on mental health, but truly there is, more behavioral and cognitive phenotypes that are challenging for these kids and families. There's orthopedic complications like fragility fractures and scoliosis that have to be monitored. Respiratory and cardiac complications, which I've mentioned in the later phases of the disease, but something we have to think about early on, in terms of being preventative and proactive in managing those complications to afford the best long-term results. And then ultimately, the lack of independence becomes, a significant challenge for everyone involved in the care of a young man with DMD. So a lot to manage, a lot to think about, a lot to care for. Christine, if you go to the next slide. And I always like this diagram. It comes from the care guidelines that were released in 2011. There's since been update to this in 2018, I believe, but I always like this diagram, and I like to show it in presentations because it really does show the complexity of management of DMD and the interrelationships of the patient, the family, the care coordination with all these other aspects that have to be included, from rehabilitation management, orthopedic, the psychosocial considerations, and round the whole circle. It really does take a multidisciplinary team, and thankfully, both in Canada and beyond, the ideal model for managing DMD is a multidisciplinary clinic with lots of resources dedicated for wraparound care and to support these families. The other thing I'd like to just make note of on this slide, as related to our ideas here today of new clinical trial designs and thinking about things like platform designs, one of the things we just don't get to do as often in the clinical trials for new therapies is really think well about how to embed measuring differences or changes or optimization in some of the less, maybe the less exciting interventions than, say, a new drug. But those are really important. Optimizing steroid use, optimizing bone density. How do we monitor for things like endocrine dysfunction? Should we be giving growth hormone? All those things that can, I would consider us to think about as well today, even when we're focusing on sort of novel therapeutics. I think adapted clinical designs could embed some of these more day-to-day questions and allow us to get better answers. Christine, if you can move forward. So as I mentioned, DMD is an X-linked disease. It's caused by a problem in the DMD gene, which is on the X chromosome. And this gene codes for dystrophin, which is one of the largest proteins in our body. I've got two charts here. I'm going to actually start on the bottom. The bottom shows the breakdown of the types of mutations that happen in dystrophin. And you're going to see when we get to talk, when I showcase some of the clinical trial work, why I'm showing this, because some of the therapies that are being developed for DMD are linked to the underlying genetic mutation. And so large deletions and duplications actually make up the bulk of the mutations in the DMD gene. And when you break down, though, the small mutations, there's a significant proportion that are nonsense mutations, which are mutations where basically the DNA is telling us to stop producing any protein. So there's a, sort of a premature signal that dystrophin protein isn't needed anymore. And so these become important when we're thinking about clinical trial, both opportunities and limitations. The other thing about the dystrophin gene is we have really mapped out well this reading frame, and what you'll see in this series of boxes marked from 1 to 79, which actually portrays the 79 exons that are in the DMD gene, is that there's a very specific way, almost puzzle piece way, that these exons interact with each other as the mRNA are put together. And some of the therapies we're developing capitalize on, what we call this reading frame, where if there is a large deletion, we can somehow trick the body into skipping over sections and restoring puzzle pieces that might fit together, even though they don't always go together. So we capitalize on this in some of our clinical trials. If we can move to the next slide. So just to be clear, this is a muscle disease, and dystrophin sits, as you can see here at the bottom panel, dystrophin sits as almost a stabilizing protein between the muscle membrane and some of the muscle cytoskeleton. And if you can skip to the next slide, please. Dystrophin, although we principally think of it as a structural protein, there's actually dystrophin impacts many functions of the muscle cell, and I've listed many of these, not so much to go into detail today, but more to say that as I show you the long list of clinical trials, what I want you to understand is we've thrown pretty much everything at Duchenne muscular dystrophy in trying to find therapeutic interventions. So all these various pathophysiologic problems that ultimately result in muscle necrosis, muscle apoptosis, and ultimately a dystrophic muscle that doesn't work essentially anymore. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the next three slides are set up in the same way, and we won't again go into great detail of any of these particular trials, but I think all of us have these kind of slides in our slide deck when we talk about the pipeline for DMD development. And so what I've done here is shown a mechanism of action, the drug, the industry partner, and then the clinical trial result ultimately in the final column. And the first category of drugs are muscle modifier therapies. So these are things that are trying to impact things like myostatin pathway, utrophin upregulation, the fibrosis that happens in the muscle. And again, you can see a list here of, unfortunately, trials that have failed in late phase studies, or have come to concerns because of safety issues. If you can go to the next slide. This group of therapies are more genetic-based therapies. So as I mentioned to you, we we have therapies that are aimed at specific mutations, so exon skipping. Many of these are very these genetic-based therapies are very specific to a certain mutation. And of course, the clinical development has been aimed at the ones that are most common first. But again, you can see here a list of trials that have either failed because of efficacy, have had concerns, or on hold because of safety. And even, the gene replacement, which many people, I think, held out a great deal of hope. We can see those trials with AAV vectors and microdystrophin have had similar struggles with safety that have had them on hold and then back in phase. And so the clinical trial landscape has been very, very difficult here. And then you can go to the final slide. And then there's other non-genetic based or other mechanism studies, including vascular or anti-inflammatory. And I left the very last one here for deflazacort and prednisone, which many of you might know are the hallmark, are the foundation of treatment for DMD. They're oldies but goodies. They really have been the most successful in clinical trials, and still, despite some medications that have been approved in various regions based on surrogate data or conditionally, the steroids, no matter how they're trialed or reviewed, seem to be consistent in showing benefit in DMD. If you can go to the next slide, please. So what has gone well for DMD clinical trial environment? Well, the good things we have going for us is the diagnosis is fairly clear. It's a genetic-based diagnosis. That's great. We can understand and have fairly homogeneous populations in clinical trial. We really are the most active space, as far as I understand, for rare disease drug development, as you can see from those long list of late phase clinical trials. We've established really good clinical trial capacity around the world. There's registry and general infrastructure around DMD that's strong. Care guidelines are clear. The management's fairly uniform across the world. And there's a lot of great collaborations from all stakeholders. Next slide, please. But the bad, well, of course, it's a rare disease, and that affects enrollment, as everyone on the call will know. And some of these genetic-based drugs that are only specific for a certain percentage of the whole DMD really even parse the populations that we can enroll in clinical trials down even more, which makes it even more challenging. And so when a trial is failed and then you have to go back and run a second trial or even a third trial, there's an example in our field of PTC Therapeutics now on a third large randomized trial for DMD. You can understand how rare disease and enrollment in these become particularly problematic. Competing trials, I think that's something that's going to be very clear in the presentations today. These really are really zap the energy from the DMD space when we're already in a tough enrollment scenario to have competing trials ongoing. There's no definitive therapy on the horizon, and the disease pathology starts early. So often, even when we see the boys at 3 or 4 or 5 or even 7, much of the disease progression has happened. Much of the muscle, which we would want to get at, has already degenerated. And even gene therapy, although many people think that this is going to be, the important final definitive therapy for DMD, really is only using microdystrophin. So at best, even if very efficient, and we failed to do that yet, will not restore the full dystrophin protein. Of course, outcome measures need refining, and we have lots of therapies that address various disease mechanisms. So I think combination therapies will be needed, but they're difficult to study in the conventional clinical trial setting. And then the last slide, if you could zip to, and then really I think what some of the most challenging things, the FDA conditional approval process, which has led some drugs to be approved in the US based on surrogate dystrophin data, and then having the clinical trials go on in the rest of the world, kids being exposed to placebo, has really done a number on how recruitment goes elsewhere in the world. We're still struggling as a community on dystrophin surrogate markers versus functional outcome, and what's the straight line between those things. Our study designs have been too short, too small. Placebo's been met with some resistance in the disease community. We've got challenges with ambulatory versus non-ambulatory outcome measures. And ultimately, the regulatory pathway, needs to be sorted out, I think, for rare disease. As we mentioned, there's still no rare disease strategy in Canada. And the reviews of these trials are often very conservative, not with a lens for rare disease. So with all that in mind, I'll go to the last slide. These are the things that we're struggling with. And I think today we can imagine what might be, ways forward. We have a lot of things to optimize, as I've shown you, but I do believe that quite firmly that clinical trial design is probably one of the most significant components that we have to figure out in the DMD space. So with that, I'll thank everyone and really look forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig, for setting the stage so beautifully and comprehensively. I think that we are now, eager to hear what's coming next, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Craig McDonald, who is professor and chair at the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of California, to be here and to educate us on the concept of platform trial and why it's so important for the Duchenne muscular dystrophy communities at large. Thank you, Dr. McDonald.
Great, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you this afternoon. This is actually, I think, a very exciting topic. I'd like to thank Dr. Campbell for really setting the stage with an outstanding overview of Duchenne muscular dystrophy and some of the clinical trial complexities that have really plagued the academic as well as industry communities. And this approach to platform trial for Duchenne muscular dystrophy was really championed, I think, by the patient advocacy community first and foremost. If we could go to the next slide, I just have a number of disclosures. I've been involved in a number of industry and federally sponsored clinical trials and have received research funding for the conduct of those trials. And I've also over the years done consulting work on Duchenne muscular dystrophy clinical trials for a variety of pharmaceutical companies listed here. Next slide. So today I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the concept of a platform trial approach to clinical trials for rare diseases. I will mention a bit about the emerging Duchenne muscular dystrophy platform trial. And then I'd like to go get into really a case study, I think, of success, and that's the Healy ALS platform trial, which has really gotten a lot of momentum in recent years. I'm going to describe some of the learnings from our initial interactions with the US FDA concerning this platform trial for Duchenne muscular dystrophy in our Type B meeting, which occurred in March of 2021. And then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. Next slide. So as Dr. Campbell really alluded to, there have been a number of concerns with regard to trials that have been conducted in Duchenne muscular dystrophy historically over well beyond a decade. The number of patients are limited. Recruitment can be quite prolonged. So the readout from the trials can be really quite prolonged. So patients oftentimes are on extension phases of the trial. We don't really know if the trial is, if that particular therapeutic is even effective. Patients are often excluded from clinical trial protocols due to their specific age or their specific stage of the disease, or perhaps a specific performance on an endpoint. The trials and extensions frequently continue over long periods in order to show evidence of effect. Patients obviously do not like the possibility of being exposed for a prolonged period of time to placebo, but the regulators frequently rely on placebo-controlled trials to demonstrate effect of novel therapeutics. Each trial has a long period of startup and setup time. Finding and training of clinical sites can be an extensive and costly process. Every protocol is different. There's some overlap. Different trial sites are participating in multiple trials. And what's also a concern is the data is not always shared between studies or used to inform future drug development. Now, Janet Woodcock, who was the interim director of the FDA, actually has written a recent article on the concept of master protocols to study multiple therapies in multiple diseases or both. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. What we're going to be describing today is really a platform trial approach, utilizing a trial network, a master protocol, incorporation of innovative statistics that allows inclusion of a broad range of Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients, and not just a select group of patients in the so-called sweet spot of their disease progression. For instance, 6-minute walk distances between 300 and 400 meters or something of that nature. The use of shared placebo arms, and I think this is a potentially an exciting approach. Next slide. This is really, there's an adaptive
Dr. McDonald frozen.
Dr. McDonald, we don't see you and hear you anymore. Christine, is it me frozen or?
No.
No?
I don't see him either.
Okay, let's wait for a few seconds, and if he's not coming back. Yeah, we hear you.
My apologies. I had an unstable internet connection. So again, it's an adaptive trial here where new interventions can be introduced. Interventions where there's futility seen can be dropped. So there's also use of a trial-ready clinical infrastructure with central IRB approvals, common site contracts, use of shared placebo, which I think is really a critical aspect of this placebo approach, reduces the size of the placebo arm and the risk of placebo exposure, reducing the numbers of subjects needed per arm, and really encourages clinical trial participation, I think, for families and patients. A common protocol and database reduces errors, increases data quality. And then there's an adaptive design based really on the interim analyses, and the data that is present really informs the adaptive design based on the probability of success or perhaps futility of a trial. If we go to the next slide. So just to give an example of a patient journey, initially they may be randomized to two industry-sponsored protocols, therapy A or therapy B, both of which have placebo arms. If we go to the next trial, there can be a third regimen added as new regimens become available, and can be supported for inclusion by the platform, again, with placebo patients as well. Now, generally, these would have fairly broad enrollment. Ambulatory and non-ambulatory populations would be enrolled. They would be receiving standard of care, perhaps standard steroid exposure. If we go to the next slide. Then there are interim analyses which occur regularly. Not all regimens may have actionable decisions at each interim analysis. If we go to the next slide. So here, for instance, there may be an interim analysis of regimen A, combining really all the placebo patients from regimens A, B, and C together for analyses, but perhaps the interim analysis allows for the study to continue with regimen A. So the study is ongoing. The next interim analysis, next slide, please. So now interim analysis for regimen B combines all the control participants together for each regimen. And here, perhaps we have regimen B that is actually stopped for success. Patients that were treated in placebo in that arm would go on to the active study arm. Perhaps there may be a regulatory submission occurring, and this could become standard of care in the future. If we go to the next slide. The follow-up then stops for study B, but the data, the placebo data that was collected for all of the regimen B would continue to be utilized for this shared placebo for the other three ongoing trials, A, C, and D. If we go to the next slide. The advantage here is that really with this shared placebo, perhaps it might be a 3-to-1 randomization. So the patients would have just a 25% risk of having exposure to placebo. It'd really be maximizing study power with far fewer trial participants. This just shows you some examples of the power realized with three regimes being studied with 3-to-1 ratio of placebo to active treatment arms. If we go to the next slide, there are operational efficiencies, obviously faster startup, trial-ready sites, master contract, central IRB is all in place. High quality execution of the clinical trials, a network of selected investigators, highly trained sites, standard data and sample collection, robust monitoring over time. Next slide. And so again, there's this adaptations, which may include stops for success or futility. It could be modifications to the dose of a therapy, to the duration, sample size, re-estimations, randomization in terms of perhaps as you accumulate placebo, the ratios can actually change. So it may transition from a 3-to-1 randomization to perhaps a 4-to-1 randomization over time. So data is collected. There are regular interim analyses. Next slide. So again, these adaptations may include stops for success of a trial, futility of the trial, modifications to dose, duration, sample size re-estimations, and changes in the randomization weights that are in terms of 3-to-1, 4-to-1 randomization, and so forth. Next slide. So again, just to show you an example here, if you look at the next 12 therapeutic trials, each with a statistical power of 80%, with let's say 75 patients enrolled for each of those trials, you'd have 1,800 patients required, 900 of whom would be exposed to placebo for a significant period of time. In a platform trial design with 3-to-1 randomization, you would have essentially similar statistical power with 1,200 patients, only 300 of whom are exposed to placebo. So it reduces the number of patients required by 33%, reduces placebo by 67%, and decreases time to a success by greater than 50% using this platform trial approach with adaptive design. Next slide. So the key features of our Duchenne platform trial that we have proposed, this would include clinical trials that are either phase 2, phase 3, or it could be a phase 2-3 pivotal trial. 3-to-1 randomization is the goal here, enrolling nearly all individuals with Duchenne dystrophy that could benefit from a therapy across the ambulatory, non-ambulatory range. There would need to be sponsor flexibility of the populations used for the statistical analysis plan, but additional data would allow for an expansion of the label in terms of safety data. A standard suite of endpoints is collected. These are not too surprising here. North Star Ambulatory Assessment, time function test, 6-minute walk distance, 100-meter run test, performance of upper limb, pulmonary functions, and so forth. Sponsor flexibility in the choice of the primary for that particular appendix protocol. And the sponsors could also add biomarkers or endpoints specific to their therapy. Sites would be trained in the platform administration of the protocol and the endpoints, and there would be an increase in data quality. 2-level randomization, randomized to each to one of the treatment arms or one of the protocol appendices, shared placebo, and then standard interim analysis for all treatment arms. Next slide. I want to just briefly digress to a case study of success here. The Healy ALS platform trial, which had a large private funding source to really launch this trial. The first patient was enrolled in August of 2020. 3 companies initially participated, a 4th quickly joined. A 5th has now joined on as of late last year. I've listed the agents being utilized. Now, there is therapeutic equipoise here, which I think is an important issue with the platform trial. Is optimally there's some degree of therapeutic equipoise. There is 3 are shy of just a few patients. The 4th is 2/3 enrolled. And I think the results for 4 drugs were anticipated by the end of 2022, enrolling at a faster rate compared to any other ALS trial, anticipated to cut costs by 30%, decrease trial time by 50%, reduce the number of placebo patients by 67%. Next slide. So again, here's the concept here. You're randomized to one of in this case now 5 regimens, 3-to-1 randomization within each regiment. These are the agents being studied, shared placebo, and then patients go on to open label extension. And here, after a screening phase, there's 24 weeks in the case of a rapidly progressive disease like ALS, where they're on active study drug. Next slide. So there are key inclusion criteria that are developed in this case: sporadic or familial ALS, time since onset of weakness due to ALS is standardized, a slow vital capacity of greater than or equal to 50%, ability to swallow in enrollment. And participants can either be on riluzole or be on or not taking riluzole or be on a stable dose, or also the other therapeutic that's approved for ALS. They can either be on that or on a stable dose. Next slide. The primary endpoint is change in disease severity through 24 weeks, is measured by the ALS Functional Rating Scale, revised, and mortality, and potential to provide confirmatory evidence here with overall type 1 error of just of less than 5%. Next slide. There are a number of secondary endpoints: respiratory function changes, changes in muscle strength by handheld dynamometry, survival, and then some biomarkers as well. Next slide. So again, this has been incredibly successful. There have been 675 individuals that have been assigned to a regime, 605 individuals randomized within a regime, 263 have entered open label extension. You can see the numbers there with each of the regimens. Next slide. So again, there's now 54 sites throughout the US that are enrolling in this ALS platform trial. 20 more have been selected to participate. And one PI made the comment, "I've not seen this level of patient interest since the 1990s. Next slide. So again, there's now Regiment 5 is now launching now. Regiment 6 is in design. And the goal here is to add 2 to 3 new investigational products each year. Next slide. So to get back to the Duchenne platform trial, this has been in development for the past 2 years. It's been presented to the community and for patient and academic and clinician input. A master protocol has been drafted, reviewed by clinical experts, multiple disciplines, drug developers, and changes incorporated. The principal investigators have been selected and have reviewed, approved the protocol. And we'll get into some proposed examples of statistical analysis techniques. So we've had a Type B meeting with the FDA, which took place in early 2021. Next slide. An overview of some of the questions posed to the FDA focused on inclusion-exclusion criteria, specifically the inclusion of subjects across age groups and stages of the disease, the 2-part randomization scheme, the use of combined placebo data, core efficacy assessments and biomarkers to be collected, designation of endpoints as primary endpoints, core safety assessments. We've gone through different options for statistical analyses, and also governance structure has been determined and other regulatory considerations. Next slide. So again, some of the key issues here have been stratification of subjects entering the treatment arms. So just ensuring that you have a similar number of ambulatory, non-ambulatory patients across the treatment arms, for example. Use of shared placebo, the key is contemporaneous placebo. Different routes of administration, such as sub-Q injections versus orally administered compounds, could have impact in terms of response or placebo effects. I think right now this platform protocol is focused on non-gene targeted therapeutics, but there's also considerations of a platform protocol for gene therapies, and also a cardiac platform protocol, which is under consideration. Next slide. Again, the agency here has weighed in on this concept of randomization to the interventions. The need for stratification has been key. Next slide. Also, the agency, the FDA has really agreed on this concept of shared placebo. So the analysis for protocol 1 would compare active agent 1 to all of the placebo subjects from protocol appendices 1, 2, and 3. Next slide. And again, there's a few further discussion on the issue of shared placebo. I think generally the FDA has bought in on the concept of shared placebo, but they've stressed the need for stratification to ensure the placebo the pooled placebo is appropriate across the interventions. Next slide. And then finally, some statistical analyses have been really discussed, which would include using both the North Star and the performance of upper limb as key primary endpoints. There's been different statistical analysis approaches. The goal would be to include data from patients across all stages of the disease. There's different statistical analysis approaches that would allow both the use of the North Star and the performance of upper limb. Next slide. One example of this would be to actually utilize for the North Star for patients who have a North Star score above 10. For those with North Star scores below 10, the performance of upper limb would be selected as the primary endpoint, a typical MMRM analysis. The FDA found this to be an acceptable approach. Next slide. Another approach was to really use standardized scores with a composite of both the North Star and the performance of upper limb. I think some of the challenges here with the use of standardized scores make it challenging to interpret a clinically meaningful change in the scores. Next slide. A third approach using a point system for quartiles was really not favored by the FDA. If we go to the next slide. So currently we're incorporating results from the FDA meeting into the protocol. We're seeking EMA scientific advice, and active fundraising is being entertained. Next slide. This has really been largely an effort by PPMD, CPATH, the Critical Path Institute, and both Dr. Rich Finkel and myself are co-PIs on this. And IACT has been involved, the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children. Next slide. Just to end, just a couple of slides here. We've also looked at the potential for utilizing an endpoint such as the North Star or the performance of upper limb and look at time to minute clinically meaningful disease progression. So loss of 2 points on the North Star, for instance, or loss of 2 item functions on the North Star. If you could skip ahead, next slide. We've looked at data from CTAP. And then, for instance, here's the Kaplan-Meier for loss of 2 NSAA points over time. 50% of patients will lose 2 points by 9 months. Next slide, similar loss of 2 item functions on the North Star. The concept here would be actually using both the performance of upper limb or the North Star to actually look at a time to event. So once patients progress to clinically meaningful disease progression, they would roll over to active treatment. And we've done some statistical powering of studies. If I could go ahead, one more slide after this. In terms of clinical meaningfulness of an approach like this, if we could just go to one more slide, we've looked at the prediction of loss of ambulation for patients that progress to a clinically meaningful disease progression over time. The blue is patients who did not progress in terms of proportions losing ambulation. The red was actually patients who had progressed by month 12. And there was literally a 12-fold increase in risk of loss of ambulation using this type of approach. So just to conclude, next slide. Again, I think this platform approach is exciting. I think there's excitement from all stakeholders. Oncology has really paved the way here. There's been a lot of startup effort. And I think this concept of time to clinically meaningful disease progression could be utilized for a platform trial approach based on a combination of North Star and performance of upper limb items. So again, with that, I'll conclude and apologize for the internet issues, but thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. McDonald. It was a very exciting and impressive presentation. I'm sure there is a lot of things that we must learn from this experience. There will be questions for you, I'm sure, if you stay for the second half. So please stay with us. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a pediatric intensivist and an infectious disease physician in Vancouver, has been heavily involved in trials in the COVID-19 space in children, and is going to briefly present on the lessons learned from adult COVID trial and how we get inspired by what the adults are doing to set up platform trial in children's. Thank you, Srin. Go ahead.
Thanks, Thierry, and thanks everybody for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. I'm looking forward to these conversations. I'll be brief. I think I have only 10 minutes and I don't want to use all of that because I think there's going to be lots of time for discussion at the end about what to do next. I'm not speaking on DMD, don't know much about that. I have financial conflicts of interest. My university gets funding from that organization to fund my research chair. Next slide. I have some intellectual conflicts of interest, and I'm a PI of a number of platform trials, and we'll hear about those in coming slides. And I work actively with the WHO as it relates to COVID-19 and clinical trial response. Next slide. I have other possible disclaimers. I'm not sure if these are relevant, but I do sit, and given that this is a rare disease talk, I have sat for the past long while on the CADTH, which is the Canadian Health Technology Assessment Organization, on the Canadian Drug Expert Committee, where we review all of the clinical trial data for rare diseases and decide about reimbursement. And specific to DMD, I've looked at various DMD products. I also serve my institutional REB for the past number of years, and so acknowledge some of the complexities as it relates to deploying platform trials in the Canadian contexts with our REBs. Also, an intellectual disclaimer, this isn't going to be a methods talk. We could talk about methods quite a bit, and we could do the frequentist versus Bayesian conversation. I am not going to have time for that right now, but happy to engage for that further on. I do fall on one side of that divide, but I'll let people decide which side based on how we talk. Next slide. We also won't be talking about sort of how to use platform trials. I've written a couple of things in the past few months about how platform trials should be interpreted by clinical readers and various things about how adult evidence can be incorporated into pediatric practice. And I direct people to have a look at those things to get further information there. Next slide. I'm also not going to talk about our global platform trial that's been going on for the past number of years, including pre-pandemic. It's run by the same shop that Dr. McDonald's DMD platform trial is. And we started it back in 2015 or 2016, and it's now enrolled over 10,000 patients. It's relatively complex in terms of regimens and statistical analysis, but not going to get into all of the details of that. I want to talk about Canadian specific things. Next slide. And these are some of our conclusions for COVID. We don't need to get into each of those individual ones. Next slide. Okay, CAPTO. Oh, sorry, go back. So the Canadian Treatment for COVID-19 trial was a trial that was CIHR funded back in March of 2020 to help evaluate various treatments for COVID-19 in the Canadian context, specifically amongst inpatients, specifically among ward type patients, in adults specifically, given that that was where the disease burden was highest. Next. Initially, it chose 4 drugs with 1 standard of care arm. And so in context, it was a platform trial with varying drugs available at varying different sites with 1 common control arm. And so all of eligible hospitals had to have a standard of care arm, and then randomization occurred to one of the available options that was available at that individual site. So not all patients were available to be randomized to all 5 arms, some of them just 2 arms. Next slide. We've reported those results, and you report them as the drug conclusions are individually made. Conveniently, 3 of the reports had conclusions at the same time, and so those reports were then reported, and then subsequent reports, next slide, have emerged about other drugs showing possible benefit on mortality for those drugs. And so that is ongoing, and we continue to randomize to other treatments. Next. So our current strategy, and this is how the platform trial structure in Canada really needs to be thought about, is that we are randomizing to 4 drugs, and this is through the World Health Organization's Solidarity Trial. And so that trial is happening globally. In Canada, we are coordinating our randomizations with that. And so a patient can be randomized to one of 3 treatments or a standard of care arm, and that data goes directly to the WHO, who analyzes it collectively with trial sites around the world. Next. At the same time, and this is another CIHR funded trial, we wanted to help coordinate research and have operational efficiency at sites. And so we have another trial embedded within our current platform and database. And so patients can also be randomized to one of these 2 drugs, losartan versus standard of care, losartan being an angiotensin receptor blocker. Next. We also have an industry partner who have a novel agent called LSALT, which has just been embedded within the larger platform. And so an individual patient can be randomized to one of those 3 specific arms. And so they can get all 3, just 1 or just 2 of those randomizations. And so we have multiple arms with which a patient can be participating in. Next. And also, because we have sort of an available patient with an available research team and further questions to ask, we have a 4th randomization where at day 10, patients can be randomized to longer steroids or standard care. And all of these questions have emerged with our larger community, deciding these are important things to ask, and we want to make sure that we have the capacity to answer them in the Canadian context. Next. So lessons for the pediatric enterprise. Let's talk about this. Next slide. So why a platform trial? Next. And so the operational efficiency, I think, is the key point. In terms of site startup, in terms of site training, in terms of REBs, in terms of contracts, having it all under one umbrella adds a huge amount of operational efficiency. Instead of 4 separate standalone trials with 4 separate standalone sponsors and separate startup activities and site training and REBs and so on, we've added a huge amount of operational efficiency so that both patients and research coordinators and recruiters can have a much more efficient approach to patients. Next. If appropriately designed, we gain statistical efficiency. And so REMAP-CAP and other Bayesian trials where they have interactions between the individual domains can gain statistical efficiency. With CATCO, which is a more sort of straightforward frequentist trial, we don't gain a ton of statistical efficiency outside of the efficiency of getting patients co-enrolled. Namely, with one patient, you get 2 separate answers, let's say, opposed to a more Bayesian approach where you can get learning across those different interactions. Next. Cost efficiency. And so in theory, with given the operational and statistical efficiencies for trial funders, and in this case, CIHR is our trial funder, we gain cost efficiency for all of our answers compared to standalone trials. Next. And in a way, this is really the main pathway towards that goal of a learning health system, whereby we take all of these random decisions we make in clinical practice and randomize them, and so that we can more efficiently learn what works and what doesn't work in more of a rapid time scale. Next. Take the random clinical decisions and randomize, which has sort of been our mantra within sort of the larger sort of platform trial community, trying to get as much information as possible from every sort of decision that's made along the clinical pathway. Next. That involves obviously a lot of silos breaking down in the Canadian enterprise. And the Canadian enterprise for research is not geared for this process. Next. So why not a platform trial? Next. In a way, it's operationally inefficient. The amendments that we always have to put in, given the number of changes that have to happen and given the number of sites, it's often challenging for REBs, regulators, and legal offices, more importantly, in terms of getting contracts organized to make sure that everything is up to date and up to speed. It's not a straightforward process, and there's still a huge learning curve across all of our research institutes and hospitals to get them to a place where we need them to make this efficient. Next. If you compare, say, a Canadian approach to a UK approach, and I always highlight the UK, which has a coordinated research infrastructure with one common REB and one common regulator and one common approach to research, while in Canada, we have 13 separate provinces and territories and various interpretations in terms of REBs. And so in the UK, if you want to add an amendment for a new drug to be tested on this common platform, you get your national REB approval, you get your health regulator approval, then you start randomizing across the country, one active protocol for the country. In Canada, you get a board of record RAB approval, you get Health Canada approval, then you go to provinces and then local RABs with changes often requested. And then you have to have contracts that are amended between each institution. In the UK, that's not necessary based on their infrastructure for research that pre-exists. And then you can start randomizing. And so the efficiency that's gained by having a platform trial isn't necessarily learned at the level of the patient or at the site because of these jurisdictional issues. And so in the end, you often have multiple active protocols for one country. Next. So why not a platform trial again? Data flows also. And I think this is the main challenge and something we've learned a lot in our platform trial approaches, where we have multiple different organizations, whether it's drug companies, different research institutes, or investigators, all wanting different aspects of a platform trial, and making sure that the data flows, whether it's towards DSMBs or whether towards regulators or whether it's towards sponsors, are as clean and crisp as possible is challenging and requires a lot of experience and expertise to make sure that it goes the right way. Next. And then statistical misinterpretation. And I think a lot of times folks have looked at our platform trials and sort of questioned about how useful it is at the bedside. And so we need to sort of further socialize these issues and in a way do a better job of sort of making sure these communications happen, so that we have a common approach across interventions and better understanding across the clinical communities. The issue of shared placebos and shared controls is something that often comes up, and whether or not a patient that is included in a trial and a result with a non-concurrent control incorporated is something that requires a lot of thought and nuance as to how it's reported. Next. And then cost inefficiency. With bringing in industry partners towards a common governance model, it becomes sometimes challenging to bring them all together on the same playing field, and making sure that it's cost effective for everybody, not just for the trial funder, is important. Next slide. And then complex governance. I think governance is always going to be very challenging with these multi-sponsor, multi-institution platform trials, whereby we need to incorporate all these different stakeholders and make sure that they're all aligned. And that requires some upfront work and some upfront thought, but can be done. It just needs to be thought about very carefully. Next slide. And in the end, research and care, which have always been sort of at odds with each other. Next. In a way, we kind of want to bring them together, whereby research and care are sort of merged into one. And I argue that the platform trial is the way to get there, because it really embeds as much as possible research into care and care into research. Next. So this is the end. I think COVID-19 in a large way has socialized these platform trials. And I argue that they are the pathway towards learning health systems. They can be very complex, and we do require very clear governance models as to how their infrastructure rolls out across our health system. And the Canadian research infrastructure, and I'll say frankly, is not well suited to their implementation. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that front. Over.
Thank you so much. I think that you raise a few issues in the Canadian context that we will have to address, and this is why we have brainstorming conversations at the end of this workshop to see what concrete steps we can take together to facilitate and expedited those trials in Canada. Thank you, Srin. This is great. For the last part of this first half of this workshop, we decide to go a little bit further than just the platform trial concept and explore whether there are other ways and other designs for rare disease. And to do that, we turn to Dr. Martin Ofringa, Nancy Butcher, Beth Potter, who are leading this approach today. Martin is going to present on behalf of this group. Dr. Ofringa is a neonatologist, staff at SickKids, professor of pediatrics. He is the lead of the method platform for two prospective SPORE team grants funded by CIHR, InformRare and IPCT. So thank you, Martin, for presenting and finishing this first half of the workshop. The floor is to you.
Thank you, Thierry, for organizing this workshop and for inviting us from the InformRare Consortium. Nancy Butcher and Beth Potter are with us today in the audience. Next slide, please. So looking at today's workshop objectives, we wanted to talk to platform trial methodology, also setting up a little bit the discussion for after the break about the perspective from patients and families. And from what I've heard so far in this workshop, Thierry, I think I wanted to add two more layers to the discussion. Number one, another type of trial platform, and also number two, another way of adaptive designs within platform trials. Next slide, please. So we're looking at rare genetic disorders. In Inform Rare, we have chosen SMA, PKU, and MPS, very rare, and as Duchenne, degenerative in nature, these diseases. And we were addressing questions like, does a home exercise program, can it improve quality of life of children with SMA? Does a diet intervention, and we're still considering many different diet interventions, can it improve the morning phenylalanine levels in the children with PKU? And in pain, treating pain in MPS is important for children. Does a tailored pain medication or what regime actually could improve educational outcomes? And here you see that we're already talking about interventions that Craig C. in the beginning, referred to as the less exciting interventions. So we're not only thinking about disease-modifying interventions, but also supportive care interventions. But they are important to patients and their families. And again, there are many of those, and they have been poorly evaluated. And to choose the right question is a challenge in this field. Next slide. So when I go back to when we all sort of got aware of the platform trial, reading a JAMA in 2015, here's that sort of table. That actually we found that, for the Inform Rare, for the disease we're looking at, we're actually looking at heterogeneous populations. And we're looking at long-term disease, with many opportunities to do multiple studies or multiple interventions, studying multiple developmental outcomes, with adaptive designs maybe, and where multiple sponsors, could come in. Again, just the problem is we have few patients, but we already, you can see from this table that we're already living on the right-hand side of this table. Next, please. And the other thing that came, of course, along 10 years ago, maybe a little bit before that, but are really the talk of the town are the registries, the disease registries, patient registries. And this was, again, less than 10 years ago when the randomized registry trial was sort of advertised as the next disruptive technology. And the previous speaker has already shown very nice slides about pros and cons of efficiency, cost effectiveness of doing trials on platforms and registries. Next slide. So we asked ourselves, could a patient registry for our 3 rare diseases be a suitable trial platform? And immediately, ask the questions: when is such a rare disease registry actually trial ready? And that boils down to the question: what are the data sources needed for the trial? How do you design your population, your intervention? Is all the evidence and is all the information in the registry there? The comparison interventions, and what about the outcomes? Are patients that are part of a registry, do we have all the qualifiers so that they are identifiable, so that they can be eligible and invited to participate? What about all the needed baseline characteristics? As I said, what outcomes are in the registry? So we decided to stop there and ask the question, what does the literature say? Next slide. What we did is a scoping review of the last 10 years of all registry-based clinical trials, looking into what disease areas, intervention types have been studied, what trial designs and sample sizes have been used, how about retention rate in trials. The second objective was to really see how often data collection had to happen outside of the registry data, for a particular trial. for example, additional outcomes or additional biomarkers measured. The third objective of our scoping review was to really learn about how the primary trial outcomes were selected, on what basis were they selected, and how were they measured, how were they analyzed, and how were they actually reported. And I'll show you why we're so interested in the outcome, in a few slides. And finally, we wanted to actually embark on a sort of a systematic analysis, a framework analysis of strengths and weaknesses of these types of trials. Next slide. So I'll skip this one very quickly. We have a paper in preparation from this work, which was done in the last few months. Next slide, please. So we ended up with 19 papers that were relevant and included, and they contained information about 77 registry-based trials and 13 protocols. And actually, we found that most of them were in oncology, cardiology, internal medicine, diseases, and actually none in rare diseases and rare pediatric genetic diseases. The intervention studies were a combination of drug, surgery, education, lifestyle. Some of these trials actually also compared screening approaches to at the population level based on population registries. The trial designs overall were actually all very classic parallel one-to-one group trial analysis with one outcome and no adaptation. And the sample size, was huge in this sample of trials. 1,000, median size. The table shows you that on average, half of the trials and actually the majority of the protocols referred to the need for supplemental data to be collected for the trial outside of the registry trial data only. Next one. So in our analysis of these registry-based trials, we found from the literature actually a couple of design strengths, like to compare individuals, in the registry who were included in the trial and those who were not included in the trial. So there's could be like, how are they different? Was that at random or not? Depends a little bit. Could they sometimes be used as a external control group? For example, the potential completeness and breadth of trial information, has been advertised as a strength of these kind of trials. And then, of course, the efficiency of trial implementation, number 6, has been touted as one of the strengths. But next slide, we also found a clear weaknesses. And, these references at the end of these 5 weaknesses, pertain to multiple papers that spoke to these weaknesses. And the first one is that most registries are not set up to be trial ready because there is no data completeness in terms of, the data sources that are needed for the trial. And there's variability, number 2, in outcome measurements, collection times, etc. Between sites that are part of the same registry. So a lot of stuff going on within these registries that need to be looked at before you can go and call that a platform. Let's go to the next slide. The adaptive approach is actually, sort of the default now. We need to be efficient and reduce waste. So we are studying currently, how to efficiently adapt trials in these rare disease populations on interim outcomes, and to see how the response to an initial treatment, can steer further efficient trial conduct. And we are actually considering dynamic treatment regimens here, which is actually a sequence of decision rules, one per stage of the clinical intervention, that specify for an individual participant in the trial how to adapt the type of intervention, the dosage, the timing of the treatment, according to that individual's response. to their adherence, to the burden, so the side effects, and even preferences and past treatments. Eventually, designs like the stick to the winner N01 designs can also, of course, be implemented in these registry platform designs. Next one. So I'm adding that new dimension to the graphics that we've seen so far in this workshop. That, in this case, just an example from a trial in children with HEAD, where they're randomized to a behavioral modification treatment versus a low intensity medication. And then based on their response, they can either stay on the treatment, or they can be randomized to a next, if you want, new regimen or new dose or new intensity. Next. So in Inform Rare, we have a very high aim. Of course, we want to develop robust evidence, help knowledge users to make informed decisions on the therapies. And in the methods core group, we are really exploring what is the smartest way, what is the most efficient way to go about creating platforms and designing trials that are efficient given the low number of patients. Next. And this is the last slide. In all what we do, we have engaged patient and family members, not to be, helping us with recruitment only, but really from the beginning, from the design of the study. So they're actual co-investigators and advisors before we go designing and opening a trial up for enrollment. Next slide. And so finally, there are advantages and there are limitations to registry-based platform trials in rare diseases, and we're learning on them. And we have our own symposium coming in a few weeks to dig into this further. And we really are very excited to be part of this discussion today as well. Last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. This Inform Rare team led by Bate Potter and yourself and many others was founded only last year, and it's quite impressive to see in such a short period of time how much progress you have made. So thank you, everyone. I propose that we stop here for 10 minutes of break instead of 15. Please keep all your questions. We have secure times in the second part for questions to the speakers and the panelists. So keep them on the piece of paper. There will be opportunity to ask questions to our guest speakers. It is actually 2:24 p.m. Eastern Standard Times, and I propose that we reconvene in exactly 10 minutes, so 2:35. You can stay online. I mean, we don't close the Zoom link. So take 10 minutes of break, and we will see you all together soon. Thank you. So I propose we start the second part of this workshop. I see 65 participants, so same number that we had for the first part, and I take that as something positive. So what we heard from the speakers, how critical is the engagements of all stakeholders at all phases of platform trials, from the setting and design to the executions. And so based on that, we thought that it would be very important to hear from the different stakeholders their perspective. And this is why we have invited 4 panelists to briefly present their perspective on this platform trial concept. And the first panelist I have the pleasure to introduce is Nicola Wortfold. Nicola is the proud mother of 2 kids, and their son is a 14-year-old living with DMD. Shortly after the diagnosis, Nicola started a patient organization, Stand for Duchenne Canada, dedicated to advocating for access to medicine in Canada. Nicolas made the difficult decisions to leave a pharmaceutical career to focus on supporting the Canadian Duchenne community. And in 2019, she joined forces with Defeat Duchenne Canada, formerly Jesse's Journey. This is the Canadian's leading organizations. The goal is to support families like hers living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy by advancing research, education, and advocacy initiatives across the country in Canada. Nicolas, we are delighted to have you here. Thank you for participating, and the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the organizers as well as Dr. Campbell for inviting me to participate in this really important discussion today. I'm thrilled to be able to share our personal story, but also reflect on the experiences of many families like ours living with Duchenne in Canada. So my goal for today, or for this session, is not only to share our family story and real world experience to describe those challenges, but also to follow it up with how innovative programs like Platform Trials and Master Protocols are a huge opportunity, and describe the positive impact this could have in Canada. If you could advance the next slide. So as Dr. Campbell had introduced earlier today, Duchenne is a progressive muscle wasting condition. And when my son was diagnosed at the age of 6, which was almost a decade ago now, we were told that he was most likely going to lose his ability to walk in his teens and would not be expected to live past his 20s. The only option at that time for us was steroids, and steroids is the standard of care for Duchenne. And so steroids, the idea with steroids is that it may prolong his walking for a few extra years, but it comes at a huge cost. Obesity, cataracts, short stature, behavioral changes, and osteoporosis. And so I feel that's important to describe this because it really does set the bar and the baseline for a lot of families when we talk about the risk benefits of looking at clinical trials. And so despite these horrible side effects, we made the decision to put our son on steroids, and he remains on that to date. But you know, we can do better, and there's opportunities to understand how we can do this better. And so this really began our journey to find hope. And, you know, that's exactly what clinical trials are to many families. It is hope. Now, clinical trials are not for everybody. But many of us, like our family, we're not willing to sit around and watch our sons deteriorate. And, you know, we want to find something that can change the outcomes for our son. We just can't sit back and accept this. So our family began to invest many hours, and again, this was close to a decade ago, many hours, time, energy into finding a clinical trial for our son. We were very fortunate to have access to the right tools, the right resources, to understand the science and the clinical trial landscape, that we were able to find a trial for our son, but many families do not have this. And this brings me to my first point here in terms of the challenges for families and the inequality across Canada on the knowledge and access to trials. It certainly does matter where you live in Canada. Access to information is not equally shared, and this gap is even more pronounced in the adult care system for Duchenne. Now, our clinicians and patient organizations like ours, we're working really hard to change this and to improve this, but it still remains a challenge. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Well, there's some background, Nicolas, and I don't know
Okay.
if your speaker microphone.
Oh, okay. All right, I'll try. Maybe I'm touching something. All right, thank you. Appreciate that.
That's much better now. Yeah, please.
Is
go
that
ahead.
much better?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So to continue our story, it took us nearly 2 years to find a trial for our son, and we endured many disappointments, but we finally did find a trial that was in the US, because at that time there wasn't anything available in Canada for our son. And we were very lucky. My son had the right mutation, he was the right age, he was still ambulatory, and so he was able to qualify for this trial. But although we felt so fortunate for ourselves to be able to find this trial, we knew there were so many other families out there, boys who were my son's age, that didn't have this opportunity to qualify for these trials because they didn't meet the restrictive inclusion-exclusion criteria for these trials. So we were fortunate, as I said, to make this trial, and this began our 3-year weekly journeys to the US so my son could participate in this trial. And this brings me to my second point on the trial burden. You know, participating in a clinical trial, this impacts your work, it impacts your vacation, your home life, your siblings. And again, we were so fortunate that we had the support from our work, our family members, that we were able to do the travel to make sure that our son could participate in these clinical trials. But for many families, to take on this burden, they just aren't able to do that. And, you know, the ability to jump through these numerous hoops that it takes to get into a trial is just not feasible for so many. If we fast forward now 5 years, it's 2018 now, and Owen's trial has ended. So we, again, were so very fortunate that we were able to gain access to this drug through the help of his neuromuscular team, the manufacturer, willingness of the manufacturer, and the Health Canada's special access program, that we were able to get continued access to this drug, but not without great effort. And, you know, the benefit of this drug that Owen was receiving, it was still under question. And despite the FDA approving this drug, there was still no indication that Health Canada would do the same. So during this time, you know, there have been so many more advancements, not only in the science around Duchenne, but also in clinical trials. And so since that time, the investment that has gone into, you know, investigating potential therapies is grown immensely. And this has created such great hope for our community. But at the same time, it also makes for some very difficult choices, which brings me to my third point. In 2019, our family had an opportunity to enroll in a second trial for a second generation therapy. This meant discontinuing the drug that we worked so hard to get him on, to try to find another, to try to, you know, to get him into this particular trial. And, you know, we don't know. Our assumption is that hopefully this drug might be better for him, but we really don't know. We don't know if this is going to be a better drug. We don't know what the new safety, you know, unknown safety or risks are associated with this new trial. And yet, you know, we're still considering this. We were very fortunate that this trial did not have a placebo-controlled arm, but if it had, it would have potentially changed our decision about whether or not we switch. And, you know, this has been mentioned a few times here, but patients and families really are not willing to go into a placebo-controlled arm. But unfortunately, the reality of this, though, is that, you know, our families are willing to do the placebo arm because we know even if we are, you know, randomized to that placebo arm, it still means getting access to that drug a lot quicker than if we didn't do anything. So there's lots of decisions that go around, you know, getting into trials, and also wondering, like, what did we give up? Is there another trial out there that might be better? When you, you know, when you enroll into a trial, you're giving up the possibilities of other possible trials if you're fortunate to have those options. So 1 year later, Owen's trial was put on hold. My son is at that phase of his condition now where he's declining. We don't know how fast or how slow this might happen, but we know it's happening. And every muscle cell he loses is gone for good. Every month and every year we wait feels like another month and year that's stolen from us. And this brings me to my final point here around the need for sense of urgency. We ended up waiting for over a year to understand when this trial was going to start again. At one point, we weren't even sure if it would. And we questioned, should we be considering another trial? You know, what does that mean? Are we giving up something else if we go into another trial? And, you know, if you're fortunate enough to go into gene therapy, in the case of gene therapy, you may be giving up future trials. I'm happy to report that we did end up getting back on this trial, and we're very hopeful that we have made the right decision. But there's so many families out there that are still waiting or to even have an opportunity for one of these trials. And the real heroes here are our sons. I mean, my son has had 4 biopsies to date, and who's to say that, you know, maybe he only needed to have 2 biopsies, and maybe those biopsies could have been shared and used for multiple purposes. He's endured numerous pokes and prods. I can't even begin to add up how many thousands of hours he spent in hospitals being poked and prodded, when most boys his age are spending that time in a hockey arena or sports field. But clinical trials offers so much opportunity for our community. It gives families hope, and it helps our researchers gather more information so they can make better decisions and hopefully find more effective therapies. If you go to my last slide, I just wanted to finish off by talking about the opportunity of platform trials and master protocols that offer to our community. So we need trials that put the patients first, put the disease first. I know there's a lot of work that goes up front in developing master protocols, but we have the expertise here. And I know together as a community, we can find some solutions that will pay off, that we will find the solutions, and the payoff is the impact on the patients. It lessens the burden, the anxiety and the worry and loss of opportunity. It limits the placebo controls. And it can standardize better outcomes, including outcomes like quality of life. It can also improve standards of care. Trials that work more efficiently allow for faster data collection, faster decision-making, and less waiting for the patients. Accelerates finding better therapies and combination therapies. And combination therapies is such an interesting area in Duchenne. I think our community knows that treating Duchenne is going to take a multifaceted approach. And through the conventional through the conventional way, this could take years and years that our sons just don't have. This program can also lead to more efficient patient recruitment, and it can eliminate that competitiveness. Finally, this approach allows for inclusion of expanded populations, so the patients that need it the most have equal opportunities to participate in these trials if they want to. This can be a game changer for so many boys and young men who don't have the opportunity to participate in trials because they're either too old or they're no longer ambulatory. And we still need to understand how these investigational therapies might help their heart and their lungs. So I really hope that we find this ability to develop innovative programs like these and give families like ours more hope and help researchers have more data, to find better therapies, and also give patients and our families more hope for the future and more birthdays for our son. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola. All what you say, I'm sure, goes to the heart of the clinicians and the researchers attending this workshop, and the sense of urgency is really shared by all of us. I hope that we can spend a little bit of time on the placebo conversations that you raise. I think it's something that we really need to look into carefully. The pediatric population is not particularly keen of having a placebo arm. So hopefully we can spend a little bit of time after. Thank you so much, Nicola. Let's move on to another very critical, important stakeholders, the regulators. We heard from presentations of Dr. McDonald how it's important to engage the regulator early in these conversations. And so we are lucky to have actually two representatives from Health Canada here. Dr. Ko Pham, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Regulatory Excellence, Statistics and Trials in the Biologic and Radiopharmaceutical Drug Directorate at Health Canada, and Dr. Pronovost, who is the manager of the Office of Clinical Trial. So I don't know who is actually starting, Ko or Kim, but please go ahead.
I'll start. Thank you very much, Dr. Lacasse, and thank you to the MyCERN organizers for the invite. We're pleased to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to be part of this discussion. And if I might just segue from the presentation that was just provided here and indicate that, from Health Canada's perspective as a regulator, there's a key role there. And Health Canada has tried to continue to modernize and update aspects that would help encourage and facilitate clinical trials and clinical trial access in Canada. That being said, one of the key things that I'll share is the development of its regulatory innovation agenda. And that's based on a greater need for agility and harmonization in regulations to reduce barriers to innovation. I think that the subject matter here of adaptive trials falls smack in the middle of innovation. The regulatory innovation agenda also aims to provide flexibility and support to innovative research and health product development. And there's many things there that will be discussed, but of course, to regulate the risks, the benefits, and the uncertainties for more diverse and complex products. And of course, the types of designs of trials that we're looking at in Canada. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip a bunch of these earlier slides because I think the presenters that came before me before the break did an excellent job of talking about adaptive trial designs, their pros and their cons. I'll touch on a little bit as it relates to our perspective of the regulator, the hat that I'll be wearing here for this presentation. But just a reminder, and I think we all recognize this, is that the work that we do in Canada, the work that all of you do in putting together what are the clinical trials, the focus on patient care, the organization of the clinical work that you do all together, and the healthcare system that we have and the role of the regulator allows Canada to really, punch way above our weight. Here are some examples, I think, that really do place emphasis on where we are as not only Health Canada's role as a top-tier regulator, but where all of you play a role in terms of maintaining our ranking in the world, from our healthcare system to our academic system to our research work. If I may ask, if you could advance the slide to slide 9, please. So in slide 9, it's just a summary of how the regulator recognizes the adaptive platform and the protocols that are being discussed here in regards to this. There's no doubt that there are benefits. Some of them are itemized here. Some of them have been spoken to in specific context. And there's no denying that innovation is important within the world of platform trials in general, or adaptive platform protocols that are being developed. And here are a listing of a couple of bullets that I think demonstrates that we're aware of this and certainly would encourage this kind of work to continue. But in Dr. Murthy's presentation, I think he aptly used a term that describes where this is in its application. I think the enterprise approach is very appropriate in terms of terms, because it does take a significant amount of work still in Canada. The way that the Canadian infrastructure is designed and the multiple provincial jurisdictions and institutional qualifications that are still required in order to put together what would be recognized as an enterprise approach to an adaptive process. Next slide, please. In so doing here, we can see that certainly there are complexities with adaptive designs, and no doubt some of them can be ironed out, and recognizing complexities allow us to be able to find solutions to them and upgrade and modernize some of the things that we do. I'm going to move now to speak specifically around perhaps the regulator's perspective on this. Next slide, please. The regulator's role, and put that hat back on, is pretty clear from the regulations, indicating that Health Canada has a very principal responsibility to the safety of participants of clinical trials. And where the authorization of a product to be used in an investigational manner has to ensure the safety of those participants. We all recognize the idea of guinea pigs in clinical trials. That's not the case here, as we know that many of the researchers are very, very careful and genuinely focused on the well-being and safety of the participants in the trials. But there's no doubt that the regulator has a role to play in ensuring that participants have that safety setting, and within those contexts are not at risk of being participants here. Next slide, please. So I think some of the key regulatory challenges listed here: safety of the participants, the data integrity, tracking progress within platform is also very important, as we recognize the larger enterprise approach to this means that the tracking of information becomes more challenging. Next, the complexity of the submission, the master protocol, the sub-protocols. This leads us to the various different components, and I think was alluded to in a previous presenter's slides, is talking about who the main sponsor is of the trial, who the co-sponsors may be, the partners. What language do we use to be able to make sure that we can appreciate what the complexities are for this, and what the large scope of the type of platform that we're looking at from. Combination of different types of investigational products may be at play within the same protocol, requiring regulatory review that's different from what Health Canada has traditionally been looking at. And although it's not traditional and we would like to be able to adapt, pardon the pun, it is important to ensure that we recognize these challenges. I think the positive note here, as I've listed, that these challenges, when recognized, means that we can think about where we are in looking for solutions and how we would address them. Next slide, please. So firstly, looking at the opportunity for the regulator, as well, working with the sponsor to address some risks to the data integrity. I think the slide speaks to that. Some commentary here showing you from our perspective, the planning before a clinical trial to be initiated is critical, and looking at some of that in order to present that clearly to the regulator so that we understand. I know that we also have to develop some of this ability, not only the expertise in-house, but looking at how we can be flexible in understanding where this is at the same time. Next slide, please. Addressing possible safety risks. Safety is paramount, and I mentioned that at the outset. It's bound within our regulations, but where that is within the context of the trial, within the disease state, within the therapy, all of these need to be reassessed and looked at very carefully within the context of benefit and risk and what that balance means. And the role of the regulator, of course, is still very much focused on what that product being investigated is, or the multiple products in the case of a platform trial, and the complexities of what that might be to the participants that we have traditionally looked at, perhaps more from a linear perspective in clinical trial, to this greater, more innovative fashion of the adaptive design. Next slide, please. Of course, if I might, and many of you are out there, again, looking at this from an enterprise perspective means that there's a lot of work to be done. And in our experience, what we've seen is most sponsors coming in, filing for application with these more complex designs in their trials, come along with them a very structured approach and more resources. That doesn't mean that many of you, clinician scientists or others who would like to group together within multi-jurisdictions and provinces in Canada, can't go ahead and also organize yourself for this. But I think that working with the regulator and arranging for those early meetings and discussions are important, and understanding, of course, how your protocol will be structured, looking at what would be a master protocol, sub-protocols, so that we can then fully assess what would be the investigational products and the safety and the implications of that on the participants is truly very important. Next slide, please. The filing is always a burden. I recognize that from an administrative perspective, but it is also very important. And as we move through more complex designs, I think we will have to be able to follow through the filing of all of these components, not only at the outset for what the submission would look like and what that complexity being presented will be, but also for any ongoing and future amendments and sub-protocols that might be presented and additional changes there that might make it even more complex. And if we can't track and follow, I think that it becomes very, very tough on the regulator to be able to do the requirement in terms of maintaining that safety aspects to participants and understanding the role of the therapeutics that are being investigated. There's also the other component, and I think it was highlighted in an earlier presentation as well, is that these are not done just by clinician researchers and within the institutions. We know that there are third parties, contractors, and all of those that fall under the umbrella of those that will be part of these types of innovative designs in the trials that we'd be looking at to review and to approve. So it's important that all of those are clarified. And of course, to extend that even further is, should there be questions around the possible monitoring, follow-up, compliance, and enforcement, all of these need to be very clearly delineated in order for the regulator to understand how it is that you've organized yourself and structured this for the benefit of understanding that the trial will produce the information that you desire. Next slide, please. The benefits. There's no doubt that there are benefits to this. And within the innovation agenda that I've mentioned here, we certainly encourage from the regulator's perspective for innovation and forcing ourselves at this time, of course, learning from COVID, pushing the envelope is to be agile and flexible to these types of changes that are going on with the environment in Canada, and pushing forward on what we're looking at is being very progressive, and adaptive platforms that are there are important for our consideration. But speaking with the sponsors in how you would be able to roll that out is key. So I think my last slide is the next one. And be open to questions, of course. And my colleague, Dr. Pronovost, is here to help with answering some of those. If not now, Dr. Lacasse, perhaps later in the agenda.
Yeah, I'm sure. I hope
Thank
there
you.
will be a few questions for you. Thank you so much for this overview. For everyone, the slides will be available with the recording of the presentation, so you will be able to go through all core slides that are very informative. Let's move on with another very important partner in this process, the REB. And it was not easy to actually find an expert from the REB space to talk about platform trials and what are the challenges that they perceive when they have a protocol to review. And we are very fortunate to actually have Dr. Mattes, who is a medical oncologist. She's the vice chair of the Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board, and she's going to provide her perspective. As we know, this is something that is currently more in the adult space, and we are here to ensure that children can actually benefit from this new design. So Dr. Mattes is going to talk on behalf of the OCREB, and she said that she have seen a lot of those platform trials in the adult space. So I still think that we can learn a lot from her perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. Mattes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't have a disclosure slide. I don't have any conflict of interest, but one of my disclosure was that I haven't seen pediatric platform trials yet, but certainly we in the cancer world we did see and review a lot of adult platform trials. Next slide, please. So in terms of the ethics or an REB perspective, of course, we are guided by ethical principles. And we are really governed by the 3 Council policy statement. The last edition was in 2018. So really, that's the lens that we look at the studies. And I'll touch a little bit on submission and review perspective. Next. So in terms of the ethical principles, I am sure I don't have to remind anybody, but the 3 main aspects of an ethics review are the respect for persons and autonomy, free, informed, ongoing consent falls into this category, the consent for welfare, and that's obviously to minimize risk and to make sure the risk-benefit ratio is favorable. And then under justice, obviously, there's access issue and fairness. Next slide, please. So I know this is a busy slide, but this is the main the points that I want to touch on. Regarding submissions, we've heard already that these are high complexity submissions. They go to full board. They do include obviously a master protocol, and then they have multiple arms. There's multiple REBs multiple IBs that come with the submissions and the multiple consents. These studies, they change rapidly. There's multiple amendments with these studies. And again, because usually there's new arms opening, although these are considered amendments, they really look like a new protocol because now you're dealing with a new intervention. And sometimes there's there's these changes happen during the review period, and of course these are all important to be reviewed as quickly as possible. The important thing when submitted to an RIB is to make sure that it is quite clear what arms are open, what arms are closed, and then if there's changes, do they apply to all the arms or particular arms? Because of course we can get lost into all these documents that are submitted, and sometimes they're not even pertinent if that one particular arm is not opening in a jurisdiction. And again, going back to all the materials that are being submitted, consents, but also drug diaries, wallet cards. We've seen advertisements, thank you cards. Make sure these are pertinent to be part of the submission. And for example, if that RIB has a standard wallet card, submit that with the original submission. When we go on to review, now I'm just going to touch on a few pertinent things here. For example, these platform trials. When we look at selection of participants, the eligibility is often based on genetic or genomic characteristics. Of course, when we talk about cancer, usually it's related to cancer, but it can be related to the participant itself. So these could be genomic or inherited alterations. What do we see in terms of the selection? Is the study looking at a pre-consent or pre-screening consent, and again, make sure that RIBs usually have criteria for when a pre-screening consent is applicable or not. You don't want to waste a lot of time writing a pre-screening consent if that's not even necessary. We're looking at fair allocation to subgroups. How are participants being selected, and then based on the finding on potential testing beforehand, how are they allocated to subgroups? And this is something that I think is very pertinent, and probably the most common thing that goes back to applicants. And again, because we're living in the area of genomic testing, a lot of these studies will do whole sequence genome testing, and according to TPCS 2, incidental findings, the management of incidental findings, material incidental findings has to be part of the consent form, and there has to be a plan in place on how to deal with incidental findings. Generally, these are platform trials that we have reviewed, are generally early phase studies with new drugs, new targets. And it is very important. We are looking very carefully at safety. Safety monitoring is a priority in terms of ethical review. And stopping rules are also very important, not just for toxicity, but also for futility, because we don't want participants to be exposed to a drug if it is not going to be effective. And we did hear in Nicolas' presentation, this is a very important aspect that, again, as an RIB is part of our review to see what happens when one of these studied arms closes. If a participant does derive benefit, what is the access to that investigational drug? So we do question sponsors when they submit these applications about the plan after the study closes or the arm closes. Consent issues. Now, clarity appears a lot in my bullet points there, because this is where we often get lost when we're reviewing these applications. The optimal, I can say this from discussion with the RIB members, that we do prefer a separate consent for the master protocol, and then separate consents for additional sub-studies, because that makes everybody's life so much easier if everything, all the or the arms are included in the main protocol or the main consent, then will be very hard to follow what is closed, what is opening. But if there's separate consents for sub-studies, that will be easier to follow and review. But then there's a few things that we pay particular attention to. Is it clear what the standard of care is and what the perceived benefit? Obviously, these are usually early studies. So, it's very important to be quite open and as long as the participant knows that there may not be any benefit, obviously they need to make a free and informed decision. Also, clarity around the assessments and interventions, because we did hear from Nicola, these studies place a lot of burden on not just the participant, but their families. There's a lot of assessments usually in these early studies. So before making a decision, the consent has to be quite clear as to what the commitment is. And then again, going back, we do look in the consent if there are potential expected incidental findings, what the management of that will be. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, just key points. I think I touched on these, but one of the main things is to obtain a free and informed consent that limits therapeutic misconceptions. We want to see that the wellness of participants is protected, and that goes to safety, but also privacy and other issues. Clarity around the protocol and consents, and especially when submitting amendments, to make it clear what is changing. Again, going back to incidental findings, which are very common now in the area of whole genome testing, sequencing, and also when we look at future research, we pay attention as to what is potentially planned. And one thing that I think is lacking in these platform trials, certainly quality of life data is usually not collected in these studies to understand participant perceptions, whether they receive a therapy or not. And I put that out there as a suggestion, if that could be collected to understand a little bit better what it means for participants to be in these studies. That's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be a few questions for the RAB chair. I certainly understand how it's important to go through all the requirements that you listed, but how we can, make the ethics review more consistent across the country and have all those RAB working, in a very efficient way. Because I think that one of the limitations that we face in Canada does not sound to be the case in the US, the fact that we still need to go through multiple RAB, and that's one of the reasons why perhaps it takes some time to actually initiate the trials in this context. And I know there are also many others roadblock as well. So maybe let's go to the last stakeholder that I think is also extremely important, and we want to hear from industry. We are lucky to have Dr. Lundy joining us. Dr. Lundy is the medical director for rare disease at Pfizer Canada, and is going to briefly summarize the perspective of industry in regards to a platform trial, how they see that as an opportunity, but also a challenge. Thank you. Mark, please go ahead.
So thank you, Dr. Lacaze, and also thank you to Dr. Campbell for the invitation today. I've been getting signs saying my internet connection is weak, so I hope I can get through just the 2 slides I have, and I hope everybody can hear me clearly. So if I could ask you to move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. I just have 1 slide, and I apologize if part of it is a very oversimplistic for this audience. But I do want to use this to set up to also where I have accountability and where I am in my role in a supportive role. As you know, Pfizer is a global study. The studies we do for registrational, meaning that the studies that demonstrate safety and efficacy that regulators around the world we'll use to assess whether or not a certain drug should be approved for the marketplace they're responsible for under phase 1 to 3 are run by our global teams. And so I did reach out to discuss the leaders of our studies in Duchenne muscular dystrophy to make sure that, I had their perspectives and their understanding for this conversation. And then when this drug does move on to the market, of course, there is the post-marketing studies, or what we call in generally phase 4. And quite often these can be quite informative and quite valuable for the patients and for the healthcare system as well, because there's a lot of data gaps that still exist when a drug is approved on the market that can be still demonstrated. So if I just go back over to the left side of that conversation, initially to the phase 1 to 3 studies, certainly, as many of you may realize, industry doesn't do this in isolation. The study design, the requirements for endpoint monitoring, for safety monitoring, are often discussed with a academic steering committee of experts across the world, aligned certainly with conversations in advance with regulators. And to be fair, I'd love to say we have always valued patient inputs, but I think this is a growing trend, and certainly in rare disease, we're making an effort. I know other companies may be more advanced than we were, have included patient inputs into it. And I think going forward, though, the patient input aspect of it, for many of the reasons that Nicola mentioned in her presentation, are really changing the study protocols in a way that is intended to, within the constraints that we have, intended to make the study as supportive as possible for the patient involvement. Those studies, as I mentioned, are what we use after conversations with the regulators to file for market approval. And as I mentioned, those are, for us, led out of the US. So we're definitely open to trial improvements in trial design. I manage all rare diseases up here, and I can give you an example. With sickle cell disease, our phase 2 study took us 3 years to recruit globally 99 patients. We needed for phase 3 to recruit 300 patients. We realized study design was very much limiting for that. So we, if we don't change things, studies take too long to bring to regulators to review, too long to bring to patients for improvement in healthcare. So there's a lot of improvements, and I think thank you. I've learned a lot in the conversation today. I've been very much involved in the implementation of trials, but I'm not an expert by any means on the advancement of design of trials. So really learned a lot today, and hope we can bring some of that learning back inside. The one thing I will mention in terms of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and Dr. Campbell mentioned this in his presentation, we have had 2 assets in this disease area. One of them failed already, a myostatin inhibitor, due to lack of efficacy. And we're now in the middle of our ongoing study for a phase 3 study, which is utilizing gene therapy. And just, we mentioned earlier, the complexity of doing adaptive trials and platform trials. I think gene therapy adds another complexity. Doesn't mean that we can't solve that if a lot of people are around the table with the aligned goals of improving trial conduct. But the fact it's such an evolving science, it really is at the nascence of its development, and we need to build knowledge together with the partners on some of the basics understandings of safety and in this area. And so certainly that adds a complexity. And Dr. McDonald, you mentioned starting conversations now around the platform design for gene therapy products in DMD. And I think that's a smart thing to do, and I'm happy to facilitate any connections internally if that would help. But we know that this is the first wave of gene therapies is really going to be built upon by evolving science, and so there will be further waves of gene therapy. And certainly, the more we can streamline those trials going forward, obviously, the better for everybody involved. On the other side of it, and I was very happy to hear Dr. Offringer's presentation around adaptive registry trial platforms, because on a post-marketing side of it, if you will, we can address some of the data gaps, but the possibilities start to open up a little bit differently. So, for example, for registrational studies, they are sponsored currently by the industry only, or the industry is the responsible for the data. On a post-marketing side, and currently, certainly that can be industry sponsored, it can be investigator-led through independent research grants, or it can be a collaborative research study where both the investigator, the academic community, and industry work together on it. So you get a little bit broader sense of leadership within the opportunity. And the one opportunity just to go back to, so what the commitment we have made and other pharma too, it's industry wide for gene therapy studies is the duration of the study for filing to regulators will be a certain number of years. We will monitor data within a clinical trial protocol for 5 years, but we intend to keep monitoring data for patient safety and patient efficacy understanding out to 15 years. And we intend to do that through registries. So is there an opportunity, for example, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy registry, where there's already a very good infrastructure around, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy research, where there's already a really good infrastructure around registries in Canada and even globally, to utilize those registries, not only for monitoring ongoing safety and efficacy, but also for looking for other areas. So the concept, I think too, Dr. Campbell, you had mentioned this around, there's so many other aspects of standard of care. How do we evaluate that? How do, for example, in DMD, how do we evaluate the corticosteroid prescribing patterns going forward? Do we leave that up to clinician perspective, or do we put a regimented protocol in place inside a registry of patients who already received gene therapy, for example, to evaluate that a little bit more rigor and develop a little bit stronger evidence-based medicine to help inform future guidelines and future care? The last thing I'll mention is just throughout the talks today, the one other area that I think that data is critically important as we go forward is around health technology assessments. And so there are, within these medicines, there are assumptions that there will be certain benefits to the healthcare system, certain benefits to the patient and their families, so maybe reduced visits, reduced interventions, if the initial therapy is successful, reduce costs to the system and increase benefit for patients, for example, in quality of life, return to work, a local economic value. And none of that is being measured. A lot of that is being assumed. So that's another area that certainly, as well as clinical care moving forward, that some of these platform registries on our platform trials on a registry basis may allow us to address some questions again to help inform and improve the healthcare system. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I will now be handing over the question sessions to Brian Stewart. Brian is the Associate Director for Clinical Trial and MyCern. And so I think we have around 15 or 20 minutes for questions from the audience to any of our speakers or panelists. May I suggest, Christine, you remove the screen so we see each other, and if anyone has questions, perhaps you can raise your hand or put the question in the chat. Brian, I leave the moderations to you. Thank you.
That's good. Thanks, Craig. Craig Campbell, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much. I thought I'd jump in quickly. I know I really was amazing to see all the expertise from each corner. Really learned a lot today. So thank you to the speakers, to the other panelists. I guess one of the questions I had as we went through this, and I guess I hadn't thought as much about it before, but maybe to any of the panelists, really, how does data sharing go, in these platform trials? I mean, you've got obviously vested interests, particularly if it's industry-based trials, but it seems to me that the whole tone of a platform trial changes to a kind of a more collective and as we've heard through this, maybe a more disease or even patient responsive thing. So I don't know if anyone's navigated that of how the data coming out of these platform trials is released, how it's shared amongst the various participants. So just a thought on that. Maybe Dr. Murthy has a comment on that, I see.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I'll just go first, I guess. I'm sure others may have thoughts as well, but from an academic trialist's hat who has industry sponsors within their platform trial. And by sponsors, I mean industry willing to provide product and wanting data, but the sponsor being the academic institution. And in that context, the academic institution sort of puts guardrails up as to say, you get this data and this data only. Industry partners oftentimes don't like that. And there often is a back and forth as to what data they ultimately get. We don't want to give constant safety reports and constant efficacy reports at each interim to another third party, but we do have to provide enough to make them happy. And so it's a constant back and forth. Each of our partners has different requirements, and it requires very thoughtful and nuanced governance models to be in place.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. Does any of the other panelists have something to add?
Sri, can I ask a question? So this, at what stage of the sort of the drug investigations are we then? Because what is then the industry's sort of stake? Is it really to get a label change and like a new indication, in your case for the COVID, or is it like a phase 4 type of post-marketing sort of an extension of the existing label? What's going on?
Both. And so we have one product that's looking for a label specifically, and we have a number of products who are just looking for added phase 4 type supportive care type data. And so the phase 3 pre-registration work, it's complicated. And I think we need to have sort of very clear rules across our institutions as to say what exactly is important for data sharing.
I think the industry, the regulator plays a role here then as well. And I think, you know, I would love, you know, if you would let me use your falling silo gif, because if only we could sit at one table and solve that problem like in 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Do any of the other panelists want to speak to that topic?
I think obviously the placebo data would need to be shared, you know, by definition. I think it's more complex with regard to the actual, you know, treatment arm, you know, of the sub protocol, you know, to the extent to which that data is actually shared, I think is really to be determined. But I think, you know, almost by definition, I think the placebo arm data has to be, you know, widely shared among all the participants.
That's a good point.
It was interesting just to hear Michaela's thought too about, you know, quality of life data, or, you know, there's data that could be, I think, better shared that rarely surfaces, and in some of the, you know, very specific focused primary outcome thing, even though it's collected. And it would be interesting to imagine that, you know, that there could be a set of data items that are agreed upon, that, you know, that even not linked specifically to treatment response, but just in general, that would really benefit the neuromuscular community.
Thanks, Craig. Terry Clausen, I see your hands up.
If this, you can complete this data sharing segment first, I'm going to take you in a different direction. So
just one quick point on data sharing, specifically as it relates to having multiple arguably competitive products on the one platform, and the challenges that ultimately exist about sharing data from one intervention to another partner and then vice versa. And so having clear governance models up front as to who gets data and when, as to like the industry partners, is important. Beyond scope for the 5 minutes we have here.
Good point. Thanks, Ryan. Anything else around data before we move on to Terry's?
Well, I think just to Craig Campbell's point, I think, you know, the clinical meaningfulness of a given effect size or given change on an endpoint is really critical. And I think some of that patient-reported outcome data or quality of life data really can be used in a rich, it's really a rich source to anchor against, you know, changes on some of the clinical endpoints, you know, just in terms of the clinical meaningfulness of a given change. So I think this is potentially a powerful tool to look at quality of life issues and patient-reported outcome measures as an anchor point for clinical meaningfulness of the clinical endpoints.
Thanks, Craig.
Speaking on patient-reported outcomes, Craig, there's also seems to be an ethical issue, you know, on can you share those data with everybody involved, and not only like for regulation purposes, but also with the providers, etc. And so our group from Inform Rare is actually looking at that. It's not my team, but we have a team of ethicists that's going to try and see if we can use those pros, for the research also in a broader context.
Thanks, Martin. All right, Terry.
So, yeah, this is more of a big picture question. So, I mean, I really understand the platform concept for DMD and COVID. You had a specific area, you needed to prove care. Okay, but if in my clinical area, working in the emergency department, where we have a number of diseases in which we need to improve care, how does the platform, and I know Srin mentioned this as a precursor or maybe a building block of the learning health system. So how do we, I guess, how do we use the platform trial to improve care in these different clinical areas? Or is that too complex an issue? Do we really need to keep it, more narrow, or could we have simultaneous platforms and bronchiolitis and sepsis and get some efficiency through building that? So is that possible? Is the platform approach useful in that context?
Do you want me to take that? I'll take that. And so like you can imagine, Terry, like a bronchiolitis platform where you study a number of different things, fluids, oxygen targets, steroids, whatever you want. And they all sort of are constantly going on. And you can also have a mental health platform in pediatric emergency rooms, whereby there's 100 different questions that ultimately get answered. Obviously, having one platform for all emergency care seems a bit unwieldy, but specific disease-specific platforms makes a lot of sense as to how we can learn within that disease. And those priorities can be set by whomever, whether it's public health, whether it's by researchers or whatever, saying this is the disease we want to learn the most about. Let's set up a platform.
Excellent. Thanks, Srin. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
I just was going to say, you can also just investigate different patient flow, right, through the emergency room. I think that would be just, it can be anything. It can be any intervention. How are they triaged? How are they seen? How are they moving through there's a lot of other interventions that you can look at. How fast do they get their blood work if that's required, or their inhaler, or yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Campbell?
Well, I think Terry was, Terry, do you want to go ahead?
So I just wanted to push a little bit on Srin and say, so why is it actually not happening? Was so far it has been essentially, for rare disease or in the oncology space, because it sounds that what you say is pretty, appealing. Why we cannot actually do that for relatively common disease, where there will be less, interference with sponsor and industry, because most of bronchiolitis is essentially studied by a group of academicians. I mean, industry has a relatively small, role in this space. So why actually it's not happening?
I'm not sure who's on this call right now. I don't want to get myself in too much trouble, but I think a lot of times when researchers ask for funding and ask for infrastructure for platform type approaches, CIHR looks at them and says, you know what, you're not answering a question right away. We want a question answered. We don't want an infrastructure for knowledge generation and synthesis. And I see Terry and all of his experience in pediatric emergency nodding, because I think he's set the stage for how we can do this across a system of care. And we just need to sort of get together and say, you know what, this is how we need to answer questions, not necessarily question specific, but problem specific, and then sort of build it from there. Our adult CAP platform sort of gets at that. We're starting to move that forward and then bringing it down to kids and bronchiolitis, whatever common conditions we think are important.
Thanks, Srin. Dr. Campbell?
Yeah, sorry, back again. I just wanted to ask Craig McDonald. I mean, one of the things that's really been problematic in my mind in our area of work is that, you know, a DMD trial, you know, sort of fails, but there's enough there. There's a hint of maybe a secondary outcome, you know, maybe a series of other outcomes other than the primary one. You know, that gave a signal of efficacy and a sense of, but the burden of starting, sometimes it feels to us that the burden of starting a new trial, recruiting again, you know, there's a balance that happens ultimately with some of the sponsors, and I think that even though they thought they had a signal, or that you know, just to do it again is challenging in the rare disease space for all the many reasons we said. Does a platform trial infrastructure help us with those types of scenarios?
Well, that's a great question, Craig. And obviously there still needs to be a pre-specified primary endpoint. I think there could be co-primary endpoints in the case of the ambulatory and non-ambulatory population, you know, which might involve both an ambulatory measure such as the North Star and a more of an upper limb measure such as the performance of upper limb. I don't think it necessarily helps with regard to a signal seen on a pre-specified secondary endpoint, but you know, if you know, more data collection is launched, I do think it helps with regard to, you know, the possible utilization of shared placebo or you know, previously contributed placebo that might make it more efficient, you know, for the sponsor or the sponsor of the trial to you know, conduct you know, as perhaps a follow-up trial that has a different primary endpoint that might be you know, more sensitive to the treatment effect. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. I would imagine just by the sense of the, you know, going back into such a paradigm with maybe a new outcome measure as a primary or enriched, given there's already this infrastructure in place, might be more attractive than sort of launching de novo again. But anyways, that's helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Gilbert, please.
Just a question to everybody, okay? Like the concept of basically having common data to be shared is fantastic. The problem is who will create it and who will manage it? Should it be the local board? Should it be something, since, okay, there may be different sponsor that may be able to use it with interest, like conflict of interest or conflict between each other. So who, okay, how do you see, okay, how to establish this common data and who should manage it? The local area, or like any idea how we can basically create this and have it something very useful?
Any of the panelists want to take that?
I hate answering everything, but I can take this. It's challenging because, like, with one industry, say, partner sponsoring a platform, it becomes problematic to have multiple different partners embedded. And so what some other organizations and spaces have done is set up a nonprofit specifically attended to setting up a platform trial that has legal ability to sponsor clinical research, and then all the industry partners go towards them. And that nonprofit or foundation or whatever it is does have the legal capacity to sponsor clinical research and has a liability and everything attached to it. Canada doesn't really have a lot of things like that, and I think that's something that we can work towards going forward.
Does that answer your question, Gilbert?
Yeah, kind of, yes, actually. I'm just very curious to see this functioning, okay, because it's actually like we're dealing with different sponsors and none of them are going the same way. So it's becoming quite confusing when it came to the time to give the service, not necessarily for pediatric, but for almost anything. So yeah, I can see it's a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I just jump in?
In the case of the Duchenne platform trial, it's really the IACT consortium, which is a consortium of academic sites that really handles the data and is really the gatekeeper of the data. But in the case of the ALS platform trial, it's the HEAL ALS platform trial, which is actually the infrastructure for the HEAL site is actually located at Mass General Hospital, an academic center, which also houses the NIH-funded NeuroNext network. But there, it's really an academic entity that has some private funding to be the data curator, so to speak.
Thank you. Ko, I think you wanted to say something there, please.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation. I just wanted to point out that the complexities being discussed here, you can imagine when you knock on the regulator's door, how difficult it is to understand when all of these things in terms of, if you recall the slide that I put up, talking about upfront planning, the appropriate coordination between the large parties or small parties for that matter, in terms of what this platform looks like, and then agreement on trial design, operations, governance, and this is part of what's being brought up here. And if it's not clear within the sponsor or co-sponsors, it becomes very challenging for a regulator to appreciate and understand what the submission for the trial would look like.
Yep, that's a great point. Nicola, please.
I actually had a question, and it was a follow-up from what Dr. Campbell had mentioned to Dr. McDonald in terms of the patient flow under the umbrella of a platform trial. And so if there was if a trial were to fail or to stop, what would happen to those patients? Would those patients then be able to go into some sort of a pool where they would go undergo some sort of a washout and potentially get re-randomized to another arm underneath that umbrella of a platform trial? Is that something that's possible here?
Dr. McDonald or Dr. Campbell, do you want to?
Yeah, there's been a number of iterations that have been explored with regard to what happens to the patients that were perhaps randomized to placebo and a trial fails. One approach was to essentially have a washout period and have them randomized, and that scenario would actually there would still perhaps be a 3-to-1 possibility of them being randomized to a therapeutic agent versus a placebo agent. The other possibility is to actually re-randomize them essentially to one of the active treatment arms after a washout period, so that they wouldn't have the risk of being potentially randomized to placebo twice or 2 consecutive periods of time. So those are, at least with our Duchenne platform trial, those are some of the current discussions. I sort of favor the approach where the previous placebo patients would actually be randomized to an active treatment arm. But those are some of the complexities of just the platform protocol.
Thank you. Any other questions before we switch gears into what we can do moving forward? Dr. Murthy.
I have a quick one. And I'm glad to have regulators, industry, and patients here, because Nicola had the great comments about placebo controls and randomizing to that when there's available active comparators. And industry and regulators always want placebo-controlled data to sort of get across the finish line for registration. And sort of platform trials don't really solve that problem specifically, i.e., like when you have multiple active comparators present within one platform, you still don't have as many placebos available. How are those sort of competing priorities going to be balanced going forward? And maybe too big a conversation for here, but I think it's an important one.
And maybe if I just can, I mean, it's not to do with the adaptive trial, but even in the current trials, I think, industry has heard the patient community. And so there is a crossover right now. So there is an early intervention placebo arm that gets crossed over into active at about a 1 year period in time. So that, unfortunately, as Nicola mentioned, time is muscle and it's lost in both cases. So that 1 year is significant. We recognize that, but then those patients do get onto an active arm.
Thank you. COFAM, did you have anything to add to that from a regulator perspective?
I know that Dr. Murthy was saying this is a nice forum here, but of course, many of the topics require a little deeper dive to get an understanding of things. But in general, the regulator doesn't require the sponsor to submit a trial with a placebo arm, for example. So the construct of your trial and what the questions are may very well be apt that you've got all treatment arms, for example. And so I think that's something to consider as well within the design and structure of the platform itself, especially when you've got multiple questions at hand. But like I was saying before, the issue for the regulator, again, is still the question of patient safety. Does it make sense within the therapy in question, the disease state, to be sort of shuttling patients around? And a failed trial is something that a platform design shouldn't be necessarily there to sort of save. It should be continuing to make sure that you have a construct where you're asking the question and the investigation should give you the answer you need, not to sort of salvage things that have come out with an answer that's negative, for example. So I think this is a great conversation to highlight some of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Terry.
Well, I just wanted to add to this question, because I think the term active comparator actually is almost a misnomer, because if you have proven active therapy, that's then that's standard of care. If you have putative, you think it's active, but you don't know truly if it's active. I mean, to me, it seems like placebo needs to be there because it might be actually more dangerous. It might actually, so I know there's a bias about active putting people on quotes nothing, but I do think we have to keep this concept of equipoise in there and not why do we think it's an active comparator? We've never proven it works. So it isn't an active comparator. It's just a comparator.
Very interesting. I like that perspective. Any follow-up comments to Terry before we switch gears?
It feeds into the discussion with the ethics application that Michaela is asking, what is the standard of care? There is no standard of care in rare diseases in children, sorry. So there's a whole career for young people on the call in pediatric research ethics.
Yep.
I think this is just one little piece of the puzzle that we haven't been able to solve.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. Thank you, Martin. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit and spend the last 10 minutes here hearing from our panelists again. And thank you to everybody that presented. Nicola, I'm going to start with you first. We heard from you, and thank you so much for sharing your family's experience. That time is of the essence, and every year counts, and having access to these drugs and therapies is crucial. From your perspective, what can we do in the pediatric community to move things along a little bit more quickly here?
Thank you, Brianna, and thank you for allowing me to share this. And I've learned so much from everyone here, and an honor to be part of this panel today. And I think it just comes down to that sense of urgency, right? It's just to have that sense of urgency. And I know there are the right solutions out there that are going to help our population and help families like mine that have Duchenne. And, it's taking into account also the risks. We talk about the risks and benefits of trials, but we also have to take into consideration the risk of the disease, right? What are we faced with here? Our standard of care right now, it comes with a lot of risk, in terms of side effects for steroids, for example. I mean, that's a big risk. And so just to have that sense of urgency and work with the patients, the patient organizations to help to find the right solutions for our families.
Thank you so much. Srin, I'd like to turn it over to you too. I know you mentioned some success models in the UK and turning things over quickly, and what that might look like. From your perspective, what concrete steps do you think that we could take here in Canada for pediatrics?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the steps are being worked on. I think the existence of an organization like MyCERN in the first place over the past few years to help coordinate our research institutes is like the first step. And their ability to say sponsor clinical research would be great. A harmonized ethics board, obviously there are lots of steps along the way to get there in terms of legal and provincial oversight, but I think having one ethics board review protocols and having just rubber stamps at local sites would be hugely impactful at getting these studies operational across the entire country. And lastly, legal and the contractual relationships across our institutions and having them be far more streamlined. I think we all acknowledge that the complexities that our lawyers add to all of our research is incredible. And so making sure that that's as harmonious and streamlined as possible would make doing adaptive platform trials in Canada much more feasible.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mihaela, can I turn it over to you from kind of an ethics perspective? I know that Sren had kind of touched on that too.
Yeah, I just want to maybe just have a comment about how OCRIB works, because we heard about Unified Ethics Board. So at least in Ontario and in cancer, that was the goal of OCRIB, to have one ethics board that reviews cancer clinical trials. Certainly there are some criteria for OCRIB applications. We do see pediatric studies. And, you know, usually they have to be multi-center studies to come to OCRIB, but we do review everything, observational studies, minimal risk studies, you know, phase 1 to 3 studies. So that was the goal. Of course, it doesn't stop there. Like once you get your OCRIB approval, you still have to get each center's approval, but those are processes that have been streamlined, and they usually go very quickly once the full OCRIB approval is received. In terms of taking it further, it's very complex. OCRIB, at least OCRIB and Cancer Research Ethics Board, has had discussions with ethics boards in other provinces, but it's very, there's a lot of legal aspects and procedural aspects that, and as we know, like access to medications is not uniform in Canada either. So, you know, but there are discussions, so at least, you know, discussions have started as to, you know, trying to harmonize ethics boards.
Yep. Thank you. I do think we're making some headway, and we'll continue heading in that direction from an ethics perspective. Can we turn over to a regulator perspective? What concrete steps can we take here to move this forward in pediatrics?
You know, I think from the regulator's perspective, for us is still to make sure that we recognize that innovation happens with the group that we're seeing here, and that we are receptive to that. Encouraging innovation in clinical trials means that we do have to find ways to facilitate that and recognize where those changes are happening. So to be agile. But coming back to some of the comments that we face here in Canada specifically, I think that many of the folks have touched on that, to say that looking at how to coordinate this, the multi-jurisdictional issues, and being able to harmonize and align that to make platform trials work as a modality for clinical trials right across the country. That seems to be impediments that are there. So if you were to present that to the regulator and not be able to resolve that's certainly an issue. And you know, it has a cascading series of effects to not know who the principal sponsor is. How do we go about looking at where enforcement and discretion is? Should one of the groups not be doing what they're supposed to be doing if there's an issue in one area and not another? And so all of these, I think, are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of making sure that that level of coordination and alignment can occur. I think it can. You know, the folks in the room here around the table sound as though they're very smart and recognize already those challenges. So look forward to seeing how, as we organize ourselves, or as, you know, the researchers organize themselves, how they might be able to present that very clearly to the regulator, and for us to then to be able to adapt to what that looks like.
Excellent. Thank you. And from an industry perspective, Dr. Lundy, did you want to comment?
So thank you. I think, you know, sometimes there's expertise that exists out there that we're not aware of. So I've learned a lot today, and I will be following up with a number of colleagues to really look and see how we can improve moving forward. But, you know, to speak to the point of even things like in ethics, along with OCRIB, this Clinical Trials Ontario, I've been on the board since it started, and it is really industry, academia, and government working together to streamline ethics reviews. So it's a delegated central IRB approach that not many sponsors are still aware of, unfortunately. So it doesn't necessarily go through that, but there's work from CTO to expand that kind of delegated IRB single center lead approval across the country. On another side, the Canadian clinical geneticists have got an incredible program going on. It's been laborious and it's been long, but we could learn from them around data sharing across institutes across the country. So under Care for Rare Solve, it's run out of CHIO in Ottawa. They're really looking and saying, how do we make sure that research data and clinical data can be shared across centers and can be shared in a combined data pool? Not easy given our current infrastructure, but they're already reaching solutions towards that. So certainly reaching out to those experts would be very helpful as well to include into a discussion. So we're not going through the same challenges that other people have maybe identified to start some solutions to.
Mhm. Thank you. Seren, did you want to make your comment there? I think it's important that you put in the chat box there, but maybe to share it out loud.
Also a shout out to Anna, who's also on this call, who's building that expertise in Canada right now. But I think really, like all of our big trials that we've all talked about use one group in the States, and they're very close friends of mine, and they're great. But like building that expertise in Canada and making sure we have that domestic capacity to do these complex Bayesian trials with multiple domains and multiple arms is tricky, and it requires some level of like institutional, whether it's academic or government funding and oversight.
Thank you.
And keep the good work, Anna.
Thanks. Dr. Lacaze, maybe I'll turn it over to you again here for any last comments, final remarks about multi-jurisdictional steps that we can take.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. First of all, thank you, everyone. I think it was a very compelling and informative workshop, and I really appreciate the input of everyone, including the attendees. I want to mention that on the line, we also have Sam Drover, who is the project manager for the CHEER initiative, which many of you know. It's about streamlining and the ethics review process across Canada in the pediatric field. So I want to thank Sam and the CHEER team to continue working on the challenge of getting all those RRB together and going through the process of qualifications and board of records recognitions. Thank you, Sam, for putting the link to the website. Something I also want to mention is that, and many of you are aware, Health Canada has launched multiple consultations for the rare disease high-cost drug strategy that has been announced by the federal government last year. Charlotte Moore at CPS has led conversation and consultations with Health Canada last year, and the need for an infrastructure to facilitate conditions of trial in the rare disease space has been identified as a priority multiple times. We at Myson are talking to Health Canada as we speak, and with the Canadian Organization for Rare Disease as well. So I am cautiously optimistic in the sense that we may see, opportunity for building this infrastructure that we have been looking for a long time. And, platform trial would certainly be a big piece around in these infrastructures to build on. And I also want to tell Terry that I think that the platform trial concept should go far beyond the rare disease space as well. There is opportunity for more common disease, particularly in pediatrics, when we have so many conditions where we still use off-label drugs, and we should be able to evaluate off-label drugs in a much more efficient way, and platform trial might be an opportunity. Thank you, everyone. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Myson website. I have some idea and I will reach out to a few of you on some specific aspect. We may consider having a follow-up webinar in a few months, depending on how this high-cost drug strategy goes and whether there is opportunity for funding for an infrastructure. It was great. I learned a lot. I was amazed by the dedications of all of you in making this webinar successful. So thank you very much and have a very good end of your day.
Thank you, Dr.